And so what happens is a lot of people sort of take to kind of openly flouting it. The problem, of course, is that enforcement at this time is kind of hamstrung by the fact that a lot of the enforcement officers are covering huge swaths of territory. So John Menzies, who was kind of the enforcement officer for the Canada Temperance Act here in Northumberland County for a number of years, was covering a huge territory and, had a hard time trying to make a go of it. Not least because many people tried to bribe him. He was physically abused. I think he was hit with a flat iron at one point. Anyway, so that's it. Now, like I say, I can kind of get into locally, and these are kind of articles that I picked up from the newspaper over the years, that we had the Scott Act in place here in Northumberland County, of people kind of doing their own type thing, and deciding to circumvent this law in a number of ways. However, to start off with, in 1883, so 3 years after the Scott Act was put in place, there was an article in the Union Advocate that spoke about sacramental wine. So the idea was, of course, at many religious services, sacramental wine was something that one could consume. How does that work? And so there were articles, and I think 3 separate recipes on how to make unfermented wine. So how to make wine that would not be alcoholic, but you could drink it, and you could, and in that way you could participate in the religious service, and you would allow all to participate in the religious service, and not endanger somebody's sobriety. So this was something that was the case. Throughout the late 1880s, there were a number of questions for thoughtful working men. So again, there was a lot of classicism that came about as a result of this too. There was a lot of sense that, somebody very well-to-do who has a glass of wine with dinner, that wasn't the person you were worried about. You were worried about somebody, in the working class who drank to excess. There was definitely a lot of double standards here, and there definitely, like I say, a lot of class-based prejudice. So again, we see these questions for workers. You know what I mean? They're the people that really need to think about this. They're the people that are going to break the law. They're the people for whom prohibition is meant to save. That was not a very well constructed sentence, but you get where I'm coming from. So, and again, the idea of how much you're spending on alcohol versus how much you're spending on bread, and all of these things, all of these facts and questions that you should think about. Are bartenders really there for your benefit? You know what I mean? Do they really want to help you? All of these things. Now, obviously they're very pointed questions, and they're questions that 100% have an agenda behind them. But we see a number of fines throughout the years. Now, these fines are somewhat controversial. Not because of their the amount, more so because that it seems like repeat offenders don't really kind of have that, for at least a number of years, don't really see that escalation in fines. So there were articles in the newspaper that did say, nothing's going to be solved by this if we don't soon, take into account that people are going to may break the law more than once. And so not everybody's offense is a first offense, and therefore you shouldn't always get a slap on the wrist. There has to be an escalation. And so we see by the 1890s, $100 plus the costs of trial and whatever, or a time in jail, and sometimes both as we go. So we see, again in 1892, $100 in costs kind of across the board. We see a husband and wife group that are brought in, and the husband is fined $50, and so is the wife, and the husband says, hey, that's it for me, I'm not going to sell alcohol anymore. Oddly enough, the wife does not say that, but maybe it's implied. That's it. So one gentleman tries to sell his house in order to kind of pay back his debts. And like I say, again, a lot of people who kind of defaulted on paying their fines spent 60 days in jail. So again, I mean, we see this. I see a lot of people kind of moving against it. That being said, we do, and I think that's really important. And this is not a situation where it's all the good old days of flouting the prohibition law and all of this. There are a lot of people who definitely abide by it, and probably a good example. Whether it's a good example or not, it's the example we're going to use because this is for Beaubear's Island. We're going to talk about Beaubear's Island. So, Beaubear's, at this time, is a great picnicking place. So throughout the 1880s and the early 1890s, and then right up until about 1900, picnics are held on the island with some regularity. And of course, a lot of the groups that are hosting them are church groups. So again, we're operating under strict temperance guidelines. And one of the non, ecclesiastical groups, or at least openly ecclesiastical groups, are the Sons of Temperance. The Sons of Temperance use the island pretty frequently for picnics. And of course, picnic in other places too. But we do see this sort of, groups like this, and the Sons of Temperance specifically, using Beaubear's Island as a place to picnic. On the other hand, we have the Scott family. So the Scott family comes to Beaubear's Island in 1894. They set up what they kind of term as sort of like a summer resort, for lack of a better word. They want to basically provide services to people, to guests who are picnicking and using the island for recreational purposes. So they're kind of like the Friends of Beaubear's Island before the Friends of Beaubear's Island to a certain extent. So, however, James and Ellen and their daughter Nora are on the island. However, that same year of 1894, Ellen is jailed for 2 months for a violation of the Canada Temperance Act. So again, obviously, maybe a clandestine part of the business. One of the services they were providing was, of course, the sale of beverage alcohol. And 3 years later, in 1894, Ellen is arrested again. This time, she's jailed for 3 months. She spends 90 days in prison, while her daughter Nora spends another 60 days. So both of them arrested back to back for violations. So again, I mean, we see Beaubear's Island having a bit of a past with all of this. Now, like I say, I know from Jim Saunders and Dave McLeod. I mean, there are hops on the island, so maybe a bit of beer on the island, a bit of Beau beer. Who knows? But this is it. So the Scott Act, the Canada Temperance Act, is on the books in Canada until 1984, when it's taken out. But at that point, it's it hasn't really been enforced here for quite a long time. In 1916, prohibition covers the entire country as part of as a war measure, as a part of the First World War. But in 1927, New Brunswick basically steps in and says, creates the Liquor Control Board, and at that point, not only does the provincial government look after tax revenue, they also look after the sale of alcohol. So from now on, it's basically the sale of alcohol becomes something that is a crown corporation and all of this. So it's controlled by the government. But for a number of years, we had again some fairly wild times here with people, first advocating for the prohibition of alcohol and then working against that prohibition for a number of years. Obviously, I mean, we remember from an earlier presentation that alcohol did play a key role and was thought to have, on both sides, it's of the John O'Brien, the death of John O'Brien in 1888. So, so this is something, again, that is and was for quite a long time a big deal. Today, of course, we understand it in a much more playful and kind of jocular way. We understand, we have, to a certain extent, maybe lionized and kind of, made heroes out of all these people who fought against maybe a government regulation that was felt to be maybe legislating morality or something on this line. But again, like I say, I mean, it's worthy of mentioning. There were people on both sides of this conflict, and yeah. So with that, I'll come to a rambling conclusion on the Scott Act and its impact here in Northumberland County and maybe in Nelson and Beaubears Island in particular. So I hope that was of some enjoyment. Again, if you've got comments, concerns, questions, please feel free to leave them below. I'll be back again next week with another topic, and I look forward to speaking with all of you then. Until then, all the best.